Hi, welcome to my channel. Every empire begins not with land or soldiers, but with the conquest of one's own mind. Is a war fought in silence, unseen by the world, but louder than any battlefield? The king once believed victory meant domination over others, until he discovered that true power starts in the stillness between his thoughts. Before a man commands nations, he must first command himself. He sat in a dimly lit chamber, walls draped in shadows that swayed with the trembling flame of a single candle. The throne before him was empty, carved from black stone, untouched for years. It was not a symbol of sovereignty yet, only a reflection of what he sought, control. Every night he returned to that room, not to sit upon it, but to face the ghosts that lived within his mind. Fear, desire, regret, each demanded obedience. Each whispered that he was not ready to rule. The lecture begins here, where power is first forged through inner cruelty. He learned that mastery of the self requires disobedience to comfort. To feel doubt but act with clarity. To feel longing but remain unmoved. The king's first campaign was against weakness, and his enemy was compassion. Not the kind that nurtures, but the kind that pleads for understanding. His old tutor had once told him, to rule is to feel deeply, yet decide coldly. The words haunted him. Could a man truly separate feeling from judgment without losing his soul? For months he wrestled with that question, until the answer arrived not in thought, but in pain. He had trusted someone once, a friend from his youth, loyal and kind. When envy turned that friend against him, the wound it left taught him what no mentor could. Emotions are beautiful cages. He began to study the mechanics of his own mind the way a general studies enemy terrain. He observed when his pulse quickened, when anger blurred his reason, when affection softened his decisions. Each reaction was documented, dissected, dismantled. He learned that emotion could be trained like a horse, tamed, restrained, or starved until obedience replaced impulse. Slowly, piece by piece, he built a fortress within himself, walls of logic, gates of silence. But isolation has its own poison. In mastering detachment, he lost the warmth that made him human. His laughter faded, his tenderness dulled into calculation. He began to notice that people flinched at his gaze, as though they could feel the absence behind his eyes. And yet he did not mourn it. He told himself this emptiness was evolution, that to lead, one must ascend beyond empathy. He believed that the soul was a chain the powerful must break. Nights grew longer, quieter. He would stand before the candle and whisper confessions to the dark. If emotion is my enemy, then love must be treason. The flame trembled, as if it understood. It was then he made his first decree, not to his kingdom, but to himself. Nothing and no one will have power over my peace again. That night, he finally sat upon the throne. The stone felt cold beneath his hands, but he didn't flinch. The chamber seemed to exhale, as though it had been waiting for him all along. The silence around him was no longer oppressive, it was absolute. He had won the first and most dangerous war, the one against his own heart. Outside, the winds carried whispers of a world yet to be ruled. But within him, something had already shifted, a transformation invisible to men, irreversible to him. Because before he ruled others, he had to destroy the part of himself that begged to be loved. And with that destruction, a new kingdom began to take shape, one not of people, but of perception. The next lesson awaited. To command reality itself, he must learn to master how others see him. Power, the king discovered, was not born in the mind alone. It had to be seen to exist. His inner conquest had forged discipline, but discipline meant nothing if others could not feel its weight. The throne was useless without subjects who believed in its myth. To command them, he needed to master not just truth, but illusion. He began with the smallest of experiments. A servant would enter his chamber trembling, afraid to meet his gaze. He would say nothing, only observe, then smile faintly. The servant would stumble over apologies, convinced he had done something wrong. That was when the king understood. Silence itself could become a weapon. A man who speaks too much loses authority. A man who withholds his words makes others invent meaning on his behalf. He started to craft his presence like an artist paints shadow. Each movement calculated, each pause deliberate. When he walked through the corridors, even the air seemed to grow still. He realized perception was not about what others saw. It was about what they imagined. Soon, stories began to form without his effort. Courtiers whispered that he could see through lies, that he never slept, that his anger could freeze a man's blood. He did nothing to deny these rumors, for denial would have humanized him. Instead, he fed the myth by remaining a mystery. The less he revealed, the more power his silence acquired. There was a day when an advisor drunk on wine and pride dared to challenge his authority in court. The king did not argue. He simply turned his gaze upon the man, still, calm, unreadable. The hall fell silent. Seconds stretched like centuries. The advisor faltered, his confidence draining with every heartbeat. When the king finally spoke, his voice was soft but absolute. "Do not mistake my silence for agreement." The man collapsed to his knees before he finished the sentence. The king said no more, he didn't need to. Fear had done the rest. That night, as torches flickered against the marble walls, he stared into a mirror and saw something unfamiliar. His face, expressionless, controlled, looked less like a man's and more like a mask carved from restraint. Yet beneath that stillness, a question stirred. If every smile is a weapon, every glance a performance, when does the actor end and the man begin? He tested his power again, this time on those closest to him. To one, he showed warmth, to another, indifference. The results fascinated him. Loyalty could be engineered, like architecture. The affectionate became devoted, desperate to preserve his approval. The ignored grew fearful, then obedient. He learned that people do not serve truth, they serve their perception of truth. Days became performances. The court was his stage, his silence the script. He learned to wield mystery the way others wielded armies. It was intoxicating. The more invisible his emotions became, the more visible his authority grew. But something inside him began to fade. The real man, the one who once wrestled with emotion and doubt, was vanishing behind the image he'd built. His reflection no longer answered him. Servants bowed, soldiers obeyed, lovers trembled, yet none saw him. They saw only the projection he'd created, a ghost of control wrapped in human form. Late one night, as rain traced the palace windows, he whispered into the dark, "If they no longer see me, do I still exist?" The echo gave no answer. Perhaps that was the cost of perception, to be worshipped, but never known. By dawn, he understood another rule of power. Those who master illusion must also live inside it. His image now ruled more than he did. And as the world bowed before his perfection, a different truth began to stir. Loyalty built on illusion is loyalty that must constantly be fed. The king had mastered illusion, but illusion demands an audience, and an audience is never loyal for long. He once believed that obedience meant faith, that devotion could be earned through strength or admiration. Yet the throne began to whisper a darker truth. Loyalty is not love. It is a bargain made in the shadows between fear and benefit. He had built his court with careful precision, noblemen who praised him, guards who swore eternal service, advisors who spoke his name with trembling reverence. Their words formed a chorus of devotion, but their eyes told a quieter story, calculation. Each vow, each bow, carried an unspoken question. What do I gain by serving you? The king ignored it at first. He wanted to believe that greatness could inspire something purer than transaction. Yet purity is fragile, and power is corrosive. It began with whispers, small betrayals, hidden exchanges of gold, quiet meetings in the corridors after midnight. And then came the night when truth arrived dressed in treason. It was his most trusted general, a man who had shared his victories and guarded his throne. The king had rewarded him with wealth, with honor, even with friendship, the rarest of gifts in a kingdom ruled by masks. But hunger breeds hunger. The general, cornered by debt and temptation, sold his loyalty to a foreign hand. When the betrayal was uncovered, the king summoned him privately, not to rage, but to understand. The chamber was dim, the air thick with silence. The general knelt, trembling. "Why?" the king asked softly. There was no anger in his voice, only curiosity. The man's answer was a whisper of despair. "Because they offer me tomorrow, and you only promise today." The words cut deeper than any blade. The king dismissed him with a gesture, but that sentence stayed. "They offered me tomorrow." In that instant, he understood what Machiavelli had written centuries before. No man serves the crown, he serves the illusion that it will protect him. He realized that loyalty is not an oath, it is a form of survival. Those who kneel do so because they fear the consequences of standing. And those who praise you today will curse your name tomorrow if their needs go unmet. The king began to observe his court through this new lens. Every act of kindness was a negotiation. Every promise, a chain disguised as gratitude. He watched alliances form and dissolve like smoke. The smiles of his courtiers no longer warmed him, they warned him. He started testing them. A misplaced order here, a delayed payment there. Some faltered immediately, revealing the brittleness of their faith. Others grew desperate, weaving elaborate justifications for their fading loyalty. It fascinated him, this theater of survival, how devotion could transform into deceit with just a little hunger. And yet he did not grow angry. He grew wiser. Loyalty, he concluded, is not something to cherish, is something to manage. A currency that must be minted daily, with rewards, with fear, with calculated affection. Still, a hollow ache formed within him. For all his insight, he could not unlearn the human desire to trust. He longed just once for a loyalty unbought, a heart that would remain even when the gold ran out. But such hearts do not survive in palaces. One evening, as he stood at the balcony overlooking the silent city, he whispered to the night, "They follow me because I feed their needs, not because they believe in me." The wind carried the confession away, as if unwilling to hold it. The king turned from the view, his reflection flickering in the torchlight. He thought of the general's trembling voice, the dagger of betrayal, and realized its edge was not sharpened by hatred, but by hunger. Because in the end, the dagger that ended his trust was not forged in hatred, it was born from need. And now the king would turn from loyalty to something far more seductive, control. For if love and faith can be bought, perhaps fear can make them permanent. Loyalty had proven fragile, a flame that flickered only as long as it was fed. So the king sought a new foundation, one not built on affection or reward, but on fear. If love could betray, perhaps terror could remain faithful. The lesson was simple, yet absolute. To command others, one must first seduce their fears. He began to study men not as allies or enemies, but as creatures of vulnerability. Every soldier feared dishonor more than death. Every noble feared irrelevance. Every advisor feared the king's silence more than his wrath. So he learned to speak in the language of their insecurities, a promise here, a threat wrapped in kindness there. He discovered that a word spoken softly could command greater obedience than a shout ever could. His presence became a psychological storm. When he entered a room, conversation died mid-sentence. Those who once sought his approval now trembled under the weight of it. He never raised his voice, never lifted a hand he didn't need to. He realized that the mind, once captured by fear, polices itself. He rewarded the obedient not with riches, but with relief, the relief of being safe from his displeasure. And so they worshipped him, not because they admired him, but because they were afraid not to. His control became invisible, like gravity, unseen, yet impossible to escape. But fear is a hungry servant. The more it is fed, the more it demands. Soon, the king found himself trapped in the very web he had spun. Each decision required new manipulation. Each lie required another layer of deceit to sustain it. The more control he gained, the less freedom he possessed. He could trust no one, rest nowhere. Every conversation became an act of strategy, every silence a test of loyalty. One evening, he called for his council. They entered the chamber quietly, 5 men who owed their lives to his mercy, yet who avoided his gaze. He spoke of loyalty, of service, of order. But when one of them hesitated before answering, the king's chest tightened with suspicion. Was it guilt he saw? Or just fear of saying the wrong thing? The difference no longer mattered. He dismissed them early, but sleep never came that night. The mind that rules through fear must remain awake to maintain it. By dawn, he realized something haunting. Control had ceased to be a choice. It had become a compulsion. He was addicted to it. Without constant vigilance, the illusion of order would crumble. He began to envy the very men he dominated. They feared him, yes, but at least they could still feel. In the solitude of his chamber, he stared at the strings of influence he had woven, advisors who spied for him, guards who obeyed without question, subjects who praised him blindly. He had built a perfect mechanism of obedience, yet he could not escape the question burning in his mind, am I their master or their prisoner? The truth revealed itself slowly, cruelly. Every lie he told had become a chain around his own mind. Every manipulation required maintenance. The machine of fear could not stop turning, for if it did, the illusion of power would shatter, and he with it. He once believed he pulled the strings of everyone around him. Now he felt the tension around his own throat. The crown, once a symbol of victory, fell heavier than ever, not a reward but a collar. He stood before the mirror, his reflection watching him like a stranger. His hands trembled as he whispered to his reflection, "Who rules whom now?" For in his obsession to control others, he had surrendered the last piece of himself that was free. He thought he was the puppeteer, until he realized the strings were around his own neck. And as those strings tightened, the next lesson began to surface: the truth that every betrayal is merely a reflection of the lies we've taught others to believe. The strings of control had begun to strangle him, and still, the king could not loosen his grip. Fear had built his empire, but fear also corrodes, slowly, invisibly, until even loyalty tastes like deceit. The palace grew quieter by the day. Laughter had long since vanished. In its place came whispers, footsteps that halted when he approached, and glances that darted away, like frightened birds. He told himself it was respect. But in the corners of his mind, another word began to whisper: betrayal. It came first as a rumor. His most trusted ally, Lord Aramon, the man who had once shielded him in battle and advised him in peace, was said to have been meeting with the enemy beyond the city walls. The king dismissed it as gossip. Aramon was more than an advisor. He had been a friend, perhaps the last one capable of seeing the man beneath the crown. But as days passed, the whispers grew teeth. Orders were delayed. Letters went missing. Gold vanished from the royal vault. The pattern formed too clearly to ignore. The king summoned Aramon at midnight, in the same chamber where he had once tested the loyalty of others. Aramon entered, his armor reflecting the dim torchlight, his face calm but unreadable. The king dismissed the guards. "Tell me," he said quietly, "why the man who once stood beside me now walks in the dark." Aramon's answer came not with defiance, but with sorrow. "Because the man I serve no longer exists. The king I swore loyalty to has been replaced by something else, something colder than the throne he sits upon." The king's fingers tightened on the armrest, though his voice remained still. "You call this treason righteousness?" Aramon shook his head. "No, I call it balance. You taught me to deceive, to manipulate, to survive. Did you think those lessons would never reflect back upon you?" For the first time in years, the king felt the pulse of something old. Anger, yes, but beneath it, recognition. Betrayal was not born that night. It had been cultivated, shaped by his own hands. Every lie he told had taught others how to lie better. Every mask he wore had inspired imitation. He had built not followers, but reflections of himself, and now one of those reflections had turned to face him. He dismissed Aramon with quiet dignity, but inside something cracked. The rest of the night he walked the halls alone, haunted not by his allies' disobedience, but by the truth behind it. Betrayal is never an accident. It is the echo of the deceit we send into the world. He stood before a mirror, the same one that once revealed his transformation from man to monarch. His reflection stared back, regal, composed, untouchable. But behind the eyes he saw movement. Not a trick of light, but something alive, something aware. The reflection smirked before he did. He leaned closer. "You," he whispered, "you're the reason they turn against me." The reflection's mouth curved into a knowing smile, his smile. The king stumbled back, breath shallow. For a moment he understood. Aramon's betrayal wasn't a rebellion, it was an answer. A mirror held too long to the sun burns both the image and the source. He ordered Aramon's execution at dawn, though his heart wasn't certain why. The act was not vengeance, it was confession. In killing the traitor, he was only silencing the proof of his own corruption. When the blade fell, the crowd cheered, but the king felt nothing. His empire stood, but his reflection no longer obeyed him. It lingered in every window, every polished surface, watching, smiling, as if amused by his loneliness. And in that hollow silence he understood. In his enemy's eyes, he saw his own reflection, and it smiled back. That smile would follow him into every waking moment. And as he turned away from the corpse of loyalty, a new silence began to grow, a silence so heavy it could no longer be ignored. After the betrayal and bloodshed, the king found peace, or what appeared to be peace. The palace, once filled with murmurs of politics and ambition, now stood in perfect stillness. Every command he gave was obeyed without hesitation. Every face he met bowed lower than before. The air itself seemed to hold its breath in his presence. He had finally achieved what he had sought for years, unquestioned control. Yet in that absolute silence, he felt something vast and cold begin to stir within him. The echo of Aramon's execution still haunted the halls. The courtiers had taken the lesson well. None dared to meet his eyes for too long. None dared to disagree. Conversations ceased when he entered a room. Praise flowed endlessly, mechanical and hollow, like a ritual repeated by the fearful. What once had been the rhythm of life within the court was now the slow, suffocating heartbeat of obedience. He would sit alone in the great hall, the throne towering beneath the high arch of the ceiling, and listen to the faint hum of the torches. Even their crackle seemed to fade in deference to his silence. There were no more conspiracies to unravel, no more threats to extinguish, only the endless stillness of victory. It was supposed to feel like triumph. Instead, it felt like burial. He realized then that power, when perfected, destroys dialogue. No one dared to challenge him, because no one dared to speak truth. And without truth, every victory lost its meaning. The crown that once symbolized mastery now felt like a prison of gold, binding him to a world that only mirrored his commands back to him. At night, he walked the corridors where he used to hear laughter. The marble floors reflected his lonely figure, multiplied endlessly in the polished walls. Servants scurried away at the sound of his footsteps, leaving only the echo of absence. In their fear, they gave him what he had demanded all along, isolation disguised as respect. One evening, he entered the royal gardens, where once his queen had walked among the lilies. The flowers had withered in the cold season, their pale remains trembling in the wind. He found her there, seated in silence beside the fountain, her face turned away. "Why do you not speak?" he asked softly. Her reply came after a long pause. "Because you no longer hear." The words pierced deeper than any accusation. He wanted to deny them, but found no voice. What could he say to a truth he himself had created? The silence between them was not absence, it was judgment. She rose, bowed her head, and walked away without looking back. For the first time, the king felt the unbearable weight of his throne pressing down upon his chest. The empire outside prospered, roads built, wars won, wealth overflowing. Yet within its walls, the spirit of life had withered. Power had achieved what death could not, it had erased connection. Even the wind that once whispered through the courtyards now seemed cautious, afraid to disturb the ruler's solitude. As dawn broke, the king stood at his balcony, overlooking the quiet kingdom. The horizon glowed faintly, but it offered no warmth. He realized that the silence he once used as a weapon had turned upon him. It guarded him from betrayal, yes, but it also guarded him from love, from laughter, from the pulse of living souls. And in that moment he finally understood the paradox of mastery. The higher he rose, the fewer voices could reach him. When no one could defy him, he discovered the cruelest truth of all, that obedience kills love. But beyond love, beyond silence, another realization was waiting, that the final enemy was not the world, nor his followers, but the part of himself he had destroyed to rule them. The silence of power had become unbearable. The kingdom prospered, yet its master fell hollow, a figure carved from a stone of his own creation. The courtiers called him immortal, poets named him divine. But when he looked into the mirror, he saw neither man nor God, only an echo of both, trapped between glory and emptiness. The forbidden lecture returns to where it began, within the mind. Every conquest the king had achieved was internal before it became external. He had conquered emotion, mastered illusion, bent loyalty to his will, and enslaved fear. But each victory carved away a piece of his soul until only the machinery of command remained. Power had fulfilled its promise, yet stripped him of the one thing that made power meaningful: humanity. He had believed that by silencing compassion, he could rule without weakness. By mastering perception, he could command without resistance. By cultivating fear, he could ensure obedience. But now, standing at the height of his empire, he saw that these triumphs were not steps upward, they were descents. Every lesson he had learned was a doorway deeper into his own ruin. In the stillness of his private chamber, he sat before the ancient throne, the same cold monument that had witnessed his rise. His reflection shimmered faintly in the polished steel of his armor. He thought of all those who had stood beside him once, his tutor who taught him discipline, Ahriman who mirrored his deceit, the queen who left him in silence, the nameless courtiers who worshipped out of fear. Each ghost hovered in the shadows of the hall, silent witnesses to his transformation. He tried to recall their faces, but memory betrayed him. Time had erased features and voices alike. Only their eyes remained, eyes that once looked to him for leadership, for love, for salvation. Now, in the echoing emptiness, he realized that he had become the sum of their fears. A storm brewed outside. The wind pressed against the windows like a restless spirit. The king rose, walking toward the balcony where countless speeches had begun. But tonight there was no audience. Only the city below, vast, silent, and obedient. The lights of his empire stretched endlessly, yet he felt none of it belonged to him. For what is an empire when the emperor has no self left to inhabit it? He closed his eyes and imagined just for a moment that he was a man again, unarmored, unseen, unfeared. He imagined the warmth of touch, the laughter that once filled the palace, the simple grace of not being watched. But the fantasy shattered as quickly as it formed. He had ascended too far to descend now. The human he once was had died quietly the day he first chose control over connection. Power, he now understood, demands worship, and worship demands sacrifice. His crown was not a gift of destiny, but a parasite that had grown from every choice he made. It fed on his doubt, his compassion, his longing, until it became inseparable from his being. The crown did not rest on his head, it grew from his skull. He turned from the window, gazing into the endless dark of the hall, and whispered the final truth, the one no ruler dares to speak aloud. To rule is to destroy oneself, piece by piece, until the throne becomes the grave. As thunder cracked across the horizon, he sat upon the throne one last time. The wind swept through the open doors, scattering petals from the withered garden into the chamber. Each petal landed like an echo of everything he had lost, color, warmth, life. And in that storm silence, the king smiled faintly. For though he had sacrificed his humanity, he had finally understood it. Power was never about control, it was about surrender. The lecture ends as it began, not with triumph, but with revelation. Because in the end, the kingdom was never outside him. It was the mind itself, a kingdom he ruled completely and could never escape. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Please subscribe.